Thank you. So I want to talk about hope and optimism, and a bit of finance, and a bit of just transition to net zero in the built environment, and hopefully by the end you'll understand why there's a smarter on this slide. So I'm the co-founder, as Sarah said, or one of the co-founders of a new not-for-profit advisory organisation, Living Places, a multi-disciplinary group of people looking at design, implementation and funding of place-based models to decarbonise. We're called Living Places and not net zero places for a reason. It's not just about decarbonisation. Rather than framing net zero transition as a daunting financial cost, as a difficult technical challenge, we exist because there's a fundamental belief that the requirement to deliver net zero, which we know we have to do, is a phenomenal opportunity to facilitate better living for everyone. So before getting into the details and the funding and the delivery models, as I said, I wanted to talk about more conceptually about the idea of having hope as a verb and being optimistic, which is so important in what can seem like unrelenting climate anxiety and lack of progress. So what is the scientific difference between hope and optimism? They're often used interchangeably, but that's not correct. So this is from a 2006 study of attitudes to these two concepts. And it found that being hopeful is an emotional state, and it concerns outcomes which we don't think are necessarily very likely, and where we don't feel any personal agency to make them happen. By contrast, being optimistic is a belief rather than an emotion, and it's characterized by a greater sense of agency, personal agency, and a greater confidence in the likelihood of success. And that's the transition that we need to enable in this space right now, taking agency and growing confidence. So we can achieve hugely positive impacts on people's lives and a healthy and resilient future for the planet by investing holistically in the places that we live, work and play in. Both in the buildings and energy systems, but also in the spaces between the buildings. We envision neighbourhood transition driven by domestic retrofit, but layered with investment in decarbonisation of heat, local renewable generation, green infrastructure, active travel, community infrastructure. And we can argue what the average cost to do this is, and there's a lot of disagreement on that number. We, for what it's worth, model on a total budget of £45,000 per property, and that's for significant fabric investment to reduce thermal demand by just over half, installation of a heat pump or connection to a heat network, installation of a photovoltaic system with battery and contribution to neighbourhood regeneration. Now this spend is going to deliver direct energy cost savings as a direct financial benefit, but also a range of economic, social and environmental benefits that will flow from that, all of which have got very real economic value. And the reduction of carbon is almost like a happy co-benefit side outcome of that. And against this return, we can build a blended finance stack of public and private money coming together. And if you look at this completed investment stack, there is a good argument to say that the economic case at a whole system level is actually quite strong. And so in theory, at least, this should be possible. And this is hope, right? There is a reason to be hopeful that this is doable. But progress so far has been far, far too slow. So how do we change hope into optimism, take agency and build confidence? So some key principles to do this. We need collective solutions, not individual solutions. We need to account for all of the value in the long term that is generated by this transition, not short-term financial value only. And really urgently, we need to test and demonstrate how to do this and stop talking about it and writing reports. I'm going to dive into each of these 3 points in turn. So we'll start with collective versus individual. So we know the financial system broadly isn't working for society as a whole. Right? It seeks high rates of return and typically will extract any upside disproportionately to generate short-term shareholder returns, but has left us with a range of socially inadequate outcomes. So lack of sustainable transport options, housing developments that are car dependent and unbiodiverse, polluting water system, and ever-rising levels of emissions. So when we look specifically at the current models to fund the energy renovation of buildings, it's almost entirely focused on the individual, with the exception of social housing. So received wisdom is that alongside some grants, green mortgages and maybe property-linked finance are going to come in and save the day, and they're not. And why not? Well, you have to look at the numbers. So here we're showing an illustration of the impact on the energy bill of those three components of energy renovation in a building. Quite different return characteristics across them. And on the face of it, this looks pretty good, right? You know, reducing the energy cost. The problem is that when you put that in the context of the cost of achieving it, it really doesn't work. So let's assume we get a boiler upgrade grant and we fund the rest of that £45,000 with a 25-year mortgage. This is how much we'd be paying a year, right? So we would be significantly poorer in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So green mortgages, what if we get a lower rate? Well, so first of all, we have to believe the green mortgage industry transitions to something that actually works, because currently you can get a green mortgage to buy an energy efficient building. It's quite hard to get one to upgrade the building to be energy efficient, and actually they're not particularly cheap. But let's assume that is all the case. If you've got a whole 1% reduction, so this is based on 4.5% rate. If you've got a whole 1% reduction, that's where you'd be. So it's better, obviously, but we're still asking people to be almost £1,000 a year worse off on average to fund this transition. The most that we can ask people to pay, I would argue, is how much they're saving. And ideally, we should be leaving some financial incentive with the resident, combat fuel poverty, create an incentive. So that brings us to the concept of a pay-as-you-save fee that's structured against the reduction of the energy bill. Capturing that in a collective funding vehicle and moving away from this idea of debt to the individual or debt to the property. To recap, so this is our current approach. We ask the individual to pay, and we know this doesn't work. They're not going to pay for a poor outcome. They're not going to choose to be poorer. It's simply not a scalable approach. So we need to build a collective model, and by which we mean designing, funding, and delivering energy renovation of a large number of proximate properties simultaneously, and adding in a layer of regenerative investment to the communities that live in that locality. And we can change the picture entirely. So we can reduce the cost per property through economies of scale, lowering the total amount of funding that needs to be raised. We involve residents in defining and shaping the future of their neighbourhoods, and in identifying the outcomes that are important to them, so we can achieve better buy-in from those communities than if we went with a purely technical, energy-led focused proposal. And then to get to our second point, by about harnessing all of the long-term value, we can track those broader impacts that are being delivered at a community, at an area scale, and tie them up with funders who value those outcomes. So we're using them to drive funding. And then finally, by aggregating the funding demand, we can access long-term patient capital. So we're looking at 40, 50-year returns, not 20, 25-year returns. So pension funds, insurance investment companies that might invest on that long-term basis. So to summarise the model, we're bringing together three buckets of capital into a funding vehicle, and we're using that funding vehicle to pay for a professionally designed set of interventions into the buildings that have signed up within a single neighbourhood. We're also funding a set of place-based investments that have been co-designed with that community. We're then capturing part of the energy saving through a property-linked contract that doesn't put a debt charge on the property or the resident, and we're monitoring a range of those broader outcomes like job creation, healthcare impacts delivered, etc. And that creates an annuity value stream for that funding vehicle, which means we can put the debt funding into that funding vehicle, not onto the individual. The residents are left financially better off, and they haven't had to put any money in unless they opt to, which would be an option. So why would those three buckets of capital choose to invest? So for the public funding, this is about changing the narrative away from one of the cost of net zero. We hear that phrase an awful lot. Actually about how can we turn place-based investment into a cost-effective way for the public sector to deliver public outcomes. Things like healthcare, job creation, economic stimulus. The outcome by capital component is to ensure that any organisations that have either philanthropic or commercial alignment that could be delivered through the scheme contribute to the funding. So that could be a water company where if you can design a sustainable urban drainage system into the retrofit solution, you're taking water runoff away from their system, reducing their operating costs. They would co-fund. The DNO, seeing a deferral to the network upgrade investment if you're installing solar and storage in that community, reducing demand. A mortgage company seeing the EPC profile of their customers improved with this work. All of those organisations should be contributing into the funding stack. And then finally, the institutional investors who are looking for long-dated, high-impact investors, which this can deliver at the right scale. So I just want to illustrate what the comfort fee payment that each resident makes is useful. So a couple of interesting or useful points to come out of this. First, we're taking a portion of that fee and putting it aside, so we've got enough future capital to maintain and ultimately replace the assets that are being installed. So as inverters, batteries, solar panels, heat pumps fail, they can be replaced at no cost to the future resident. And secondly, while the principal use of the remaining fee is to repay capital that we can effectively sell to pension funds to raise some of the capital to do this work in the first place, you can't borrow against 100% of that income. No lender is going to lend against 100% of the income, it's too risky. So you are forced to make this model profitable. You're forced to leave some of that income in the funding vehicle each year. And typically in sort of traditional public-private models, this would be where the private sector squirrels away all that extractive profit. But there are some really interesting models starting to build where that can be recycled back as an annual income stream to communities to support them, which enhances the legitimacy of this kind of approach, but also the value that's created in terms of improving lives. So to recap, for the community, no upfront cost, the lower energy bills, obviously a nicer, warmer, healthier home, and the ability to take some agency in the place that they live and redesigning that place. For government, the cost goes down overall. The amount of that cost we can shift to the private sector goes up, reducing public sector contribution, and critically, can actually do something. You can probably hear the frustration. So, how do we go beyond this as an idea and actually move to doing something, scaling up? So less talking, more doing. So what does doing look like? We urgently need to develop the business cases to do this. We need investment and procurement-ready business plans for specific areas that have the buy-in from the communities that live in those areas. They will then allow us to raise the capital to actually do these programs, actually fund them. Inevitably, this is going to be significantly public funded in early proof of concept stage. But as we iterate, de-risk the model, and start to scale, that balance will shift more and more towards the private sector. There's a wide range of interdependent work streams that would need to be done to build these business cases, which is going to take collaboration, cooperation, harmonization, not polarization, between a diverse group of stakeholders to deliver. We're building a humongous Gantt chart behind this, which is effectively a program of works of what needs to be done to deliver this project. And the optimal way we think to carry this out is by working with a cohort of local authorities. Those local authorities have to have sufficient funding to have a team dedicated to do this work and a budget to commission some of the specific local work they're going to need around data collection, community engagement, etc. You need a budget to do some retrofit while you're building the business cases. When we build new build developments, we do a show home so people can see what they might be buying. It's the same concept. We need to retrofit some houses. And you need a shared program of external expertise that is coordinated to deliver the most cost-effective support and ensure learning between that cohort and to speed up the process so we can move to implementation as soon as possible. In terms of the need for speed, there are 14 million minutes until 2050. There are 28 million homes in the UK, so you can probably do the math of that. We need to start moving at speed. We are all guilty of having sat around talking about this for far too long already. The concepts are there. There are so many ideas, so many possibilities in this room, let alone more broadly in the country, and yet we can't get moving on really tackling the huge part of the housing market that sits between social housing on one side and the teeny proportion of the population who have the money and motivation to actually do this on their own. So why can't we get moving? Fundamentally, because there is an enormous gap in the UK on project development funding. What we need to do to carry out this work. Raising the 100 million to retrofit a load of homes is much easier than raising the 1 or 2 million to create the business case to raise the 100 million. It's an incredible frustration. Grant funding sources that are available in the EU are no longer available here, and they haven't been replaced in a coordinated manner. The funding that is available is fragmented. It often has to be spent by unrealistically tight time deadlines, and often has conditions around it which discourage innovation and more holistic approaches, as I've outlined. Plus, it's nearly always part of a competitive process that diverts the incredibly scarce resource that sits in local government and in the not-for-profit sector into filling out forms rather than doing the actual work. I spent half my life filling out funding forms, which is just, I don't have the words that I can use on this stage to describe that. There is currently a standoff between the interested parties to get this work done, which is stopping it happening. Community groups we know are already mobilising to develop their own neighbourhood retrofit plans. Major infrastructure developers are keen to test place-based models to retrofit. Local authorities are seeing opportunities to create propositions that bring decarbonised heat and energy infrastructure into neighbourhood regeneration, reducing fuel poverty, creating more climate resilience in neighbourhoods. The financial markets even are shifting, and new opportunities for large-scale investment in climate resilience are opening up. We are sitting on our hands while the world's moving around us. We need to build on the existing momentum and construct a pathway to the future we want to live in. I'm going to go back to the science. A different study first, and I'll come back to this one. So there's a study in 2016 that looked at hope and optimism in football fans. Duncan Smith is here somewhere, so the last slide, I promise. For heavily invested fans of poorly performing teams, where a good result, you could always possibly pull off an upset and win the game, but it was highly unlikely. The fans were pessimistic but hopeful. When you looked at the top performing teams, the fans were optimistic. And actually they didn't understand the difference between hope and optimism. They seem like the same thing. So if you come back to the understanding that we need to move from talking to doing, we need to take agency to build confidence that we can deliver a positive outcome, this hope to optimism transition I've talked about, it's time for national government, the philanthropic sector, the financial services sector, and the corporate sector to come together and collectively provide that development capital to build out these models. So coming back to this study, and they didn't just look at hope and optimism, they looked at a range of other concepts. So we've gone from the seedling of hope to the plant of optimism, but one of the other ones they looked at was joy. And joy is optimism with added agency, and that is where we could get to. That's the transition we really need to move to, but we have to start now. Thank you.